This is the forbidden book they didn't want you to read, the one that turns you into a money magnet. As you listen, you'll uncover the truth. Wealth was never meant to be kept from you, only hidden by those who feared what you might become. The forbidden path to wealth begins now. Introduction. There exists a teaching so quietly guarded, so carefully kept from ordinary hands across so many generations, that most who might have benefited from it never once heard its true name spoken aloud. You have been told, in 100 small and unremarkable ways since your earliest years, that wealth is a matter of luck, of birth, of circumstances entirely beyond your reach, that some are simply born to it, and the rest are born to labor for scraps of it their whole lives through, grateful for whatever falls their way. This is not truth. It is a carefully maintained silence, and silence, when maintained long enough and by enough hands, begins to look very much like truth to those who were never shown otherwise. There have always been those who benefited, quietly and considerably, from keeping the struggling majority unaware of what the mind itself is truly capable of drawing toward it. A servant who believes wealth impossible makes a far more contented servant. A worker who has never questioned his lot labors more willingly, and complains far less, than one who suspects an entirely different life might be available to him, should he only know how to reach for it. And so, across centuries, in ways subtle and in ways not so subtle, the true nature of the mind's magnetic power, its ability to draw money and opportunity toward itself, not through force or frantic labor, but through a quiet and deliberately cultivated inner state, was allowed to fade from common knowledge, dismissed as superstition where it could not simply be ignored, buried in old texts where it could not be safely ridiculed. This forbidden teaching does not ask you to labor harder than you already have. It does not ask you to scheme, to manipulate, to take from another what rightfully belongs to them. It asks something far quieter and, in truth, far more remarkable, that you become, in your own inner state, the kind of presence toward which money and opportunity naturally and inevitably flow the way iron filings gather, without struggle or persuasion, around a lodestone that has done nothing more than remain quietly and steadily what it is. You may feel, as you begin this teaching, some small and lingering guilt at the very idea of wanting more than you currently have a quiet voice, inherited from parents or teachers or the general atmosphere of your upbringing, suggesting that such wanting is somehow improper or greedy or unbecoming of someone in your station. Set that voice aside now, gently but firmly, for it was never truly yours to begin with. It was given to you by those who, whether they meant to or not, benefited from your believing it. What follows is not an invention, but a rediscovery, the forgotten path once known only to a rare few, who guarded it quietly as their own private advantage, while the rest of the world was taught only to labor and to wait. That guarding ends here, in these pages, with you. Enter this forbidden teaching with an open mind and a receptive heart, setting aside whatever doubt or guilt has followed you to this moment, for what waits ahead in Part 1 is simply the truth that was always yours by right, however long it was kept from you. Act 1. The Forbidden Teaching Uncovered. Chapter 1. The Book They Tried to Bury. Cassius Merriweather worked as a young archivist in a great university library, spending his quiet days cataloging manuscripts that had sat undisturbed on their shelves for generations, their spines cracked, and their pages yellowed with age and neglect. One autumn afternoon, sorting through a box of documents recently donated from a dissolved private estate, he came across a slim and deliberately misfiled manuscript, tucked improperly among unrelated agricultural records as though someone, long ago, had wished it never to be found by any casual searcher. Its pages described, in careful and confident handwriting, a forgotten law of attraction, the mind's power to draw wealth toward itself through inner alignment rather than outward striving. Cassius sat with it for a long while, wondering why any book of such evident sincerity and craft would ever have been so carefully hidden away, filed where no honest searcher would ever think to look. Certain teachings on wealth were never lost by simple accident, however convenient that explanation might seem to the casual observer. They were quietly buried, discouraged, or dismissed outright as superstition by those who had every reason to keep the struggling majority unaware of what such teachings revealed. A population convinced that wealth is random or reserved for the fortunate few, or achievable only through relentless suffering, is a population far less likely to question why it struggles so, or to seek an easier and more natural path toward the abundance it has been taught to consider impossible. Not far from where Cassius worked, in a public library some miles distant, a librarian named Beatrix Underhill was quietly warned by a senior colleague against sharing certain old volumes with the public volumes describing, in language remarkably similar to what Cassius had found, the mind's power to attract abundance. She was told, vaguely and without real explanation, that such material was not appropriate for general circulation, though no one could ever explain to her satisfaction precisely why this should be so. She found herself wondering, in the quiet hours after such conversations, whose interest that particular warning truly served, and whether it served the public at all, or merely those who preferred the public remain unaware. Consider how readily you, too, may have dismissed such teachings as mere superstition before this very evening, nodding along, perhaps, with the common wisdom that such ideas are fanciful nonsense, without ever once examining who first taught you to believe so, or why they might have benefited from your believing it. Practice. Tonight, set aside one inherited assumption you have long carried, that wealth teachings such as this one are not to be taken seriously. You need not replace it with certainty just yet. Simply set it down gently and allow yourself the freedom to consider what follows with fresh and open attention. Chapter 2. Why Abundance Was Made to Seem Forbidden. Horace Delacroix owned a modest factory on the edge of a busy industrial town, and he took quiet and deliberate care to discourage any talk among his workers of getting ahead, of bettering their circumstances beyond their current station. He was not a cruel man in any obvious sense, but he understood, in some unspoken way he rarely examined even to himself, that a workforce content with its lot, convinced that ambition beyond a certain point was unrealistic or even improper, was a workforce far easier to manage than one that believed genuine abundance might be within its reach. Those who profited from the struggle of others have always had every reason to make abundance seem forbidden, dangerous, or reserved only for the fortunate few born into it. Keeping the true nature of the mind's power carefully out of common reach served, quite conveniently, the interests of those who benefited from the labor of people who never thought to question their circumstances at all. Millicent Fairbanks, a young seamstress in a nearby town, was quietly mocked by her own family whenever she dared to speak of one day being wealthy, as though the very idea were somehow improper for someone of her modest station in life. Her aunts would exchange knowing glances. Her own mother would gently, but firmly, remind her to be grateful for what she had and not to reach above herself. And so, slowly and almost imperceptibly, Millicent learned to silence the very hope that might have carried her toward the abundance she secretly, quietly, still longed for. Consider who may have benefited, across your own life, from convincing you that wealth was simply not meant for people like you, a parent perhaps, exhausted by their own struggles and unable to imagine anything different for their child, a teacher, perhaps, more comfortable with modest expectations than ambitious ones, or simply the general, unspoken atmosphere of a world that has long preferred its majority to remain unaware of what it might otherwise become. Practice. Tonight, Identify one voice, past or present, that discouraged your belief in your own potential wealth. Name that voice quietly to yourself and consciously set it aside, recognizing that its warning may have served its own comfort far more than it ever served your genuine potential. Chapter 3. The Magnetic Nature of the Mind. Reginald Ashworth, a blacksmith of considerable skill and quiet curiosity, kept a small lodestone on his workbench, a curious souvenir from a traveling merchant, and would often pause in his labor to watch, with genuine fascination, how it drew iron filings toward itself without any visible effort or force whatsoever. No pushing, no pulling, only a quiet and steady presence that the iron simply, naturally, gathered around. He began to wonder, turning the stone over in his calloused hands during quiet evenings, whether his own mind might work by some similar and equally unseen law, quietly drawing toward it whatever matched its own steady inner state. The mind, once properly aligned, draws money and opportunity toward it in remarkably similar fashion to how a magnet draws metal not through force and not through frantic effort, but through a quiet and steady inner state that other things, quite naturally, find themselves gathering around. This is not mysticism removed from practical reality. It is simply a law as real and as consistent as the lodestone's own quiet pull, though far less visible to the casual eye. Prudence Hallworth, a laundress working in the very same town as Reginald, struggled and strained for money through constant and exhausting effort alone, taking on extra work whenever she could, denying herself rest, laboring from the earliest hours of morning until well past dark. She never once suspected that her own mind might do the greater share of the drawing, if only she thought to align it rightly, and that her exhausting effort, undertaken without such alignment, might be laboring against itself far more than it labored for her. Consider your own mind, in this moment, not as something entirely separate from your outward circumstances, watching them unfold as a spectator watches weather pass overhead, but as the very field that draws those circumstances toward you, quietly and continuously, whether you have ever thought to notice it doing so. Practice. Tonight, imagine your own mind as a magnet, gently and steadily drawing one specific form of abundance toward you. Hold this image softly, without strain, as though simply allowing what is already yours by nature to gather near. Chapter 4. The First Law. Attraction precedes effort. Nathaniel Coswell, a peddler who walked from town to town with his cart of small goods, worked tirelessly from the earliest hour of dawn until well after dusk each day, and yet remained, year after exhausting year, perpetually and stubbornly poor, his labor never quite translating into the ease he so desperately sought. A quieter neighbor of his, a man who kept far shorter hours and appeared, by any outward measure, considerably less industrious, seemed nonetheless to prosper steadily, his modest shop growing a little each season, while Nathaniel's cart grew only more worn. Circumstances are drawn toward a person by their inner state long before any outward action is ever taken to earn them, and effort undertaken without such inner alignment often labors, quite exhaustingly, against itself, pushing hard against a door that inner alignment would have opened with a single gentle touch. Josephine Wren, a dressmaker in a nearby village, took up a calm and deliberate inner practice, aligning her mind each morning before ever beginning her outward labor for the day, and found opportunities arriving with an ease that startled her customers appearing just when she needed them, fair prices offered without her having to negotiate, small strokes of fortune that seemed to find her rather than requiring that she chase them down through exhausting effort. Consider whether your own effort, across however many years you have given to it, has been spent without first securing the inner alignment that draws results toward it naturally, rather than requiring that you force them into being through sheer and often futile exertion. Practice. Before any effort tonight or tomorrow, Pause first to align your mind quietly toward the outcome you desire, holding that alignment gently before allowing any outward action to follow it. Chapter 5. The Guarded Secret of the Wealthy Few. Ambrose Kettlewell, a young clerk working alongside a quietly wealthy merchant in a prosperous trading house, began to notice, over the course of many months in the merchant's employ, a certain calm and deliberate manner the older man carried with him, always a steadiness in his bearing, an unhurried quality to his speech and his decisions, that the merchant himself never once explained to anyone around him, as though it were simply his private and unremarked nature rather than a deliberate practice he had cultivated across many years. A small number of individuals throughout history have always known and quietly practiced this law of attraction, guarding it carefully as their own private advantage, rather than sharing it openly with those around them who might have benefited just as richly from its knowledge. This guarding was rarely malicious. It was simply the natural instinct to protect what felt, to those who possessed it, like a rare and precious inheritance. Cordelia Ashgrove, a widow in her later years, befriended the widow of just such a merchant, and was finally shown quite late in both their lives the simple and private habits her friend's late husband had practiced quietly for decades, small, unremarkable rituals of thought and feeling that he had never once spoken of to his own children, believing perhaps that such things were better shown through the quiet example of a prosperous life than through direct instruction that might have seemed, to a skeptical listener, too simple to be believed. Consider that you now stand where very few across the whole of history were ever permitted to stand receiving directly what was once passed only quietly and rarely, from one guarded practitioner to another. Practice. Reflect briefly this evening on one private habit of mind you are now willing to quietly adopt as your own, choosing it deliberately rather than waiting to be shown it by another, as Cordelia so long had to wait. Chapter 6. Breaking the Spell of Not for People Like Me. Wilhelmina Cross was raised, from her earliest childhood, to believe that wealth belonged only to those fortunate enough to be born into it, that people of her own more modest station simply were not meant to possess such things, however hard they labored or however sincerely they hoped. One evening, gently correcting her own young daughter's ambitious talk of one day being rich, she caught herself repeating this very same inherited belief, word for word almost, without ever once having questioned whether it was true. The belief that wealth is not for people like me is precisely the spell this forbidden teaching was designed, from its very origin, to break, for such a belief quietly and effectively repels the very abundance it insists, with such quiet certainty, is impossible to obtain. Barnaby Thistlewood, a tradesman well into middle age, finally questioned this same inherited belief for the very first time one restless evening, turning it over in his mind as one might turn over an old family heirloom never before examined closely, and was genuinely startled to find no real evidence behind it at all, no logical foundation, no factual basis. Only the accumulated weight of having heard it repeated so often, by so many people, for so very long. Examine whether you too have quietly accepted that wealth is simply not for people like you, without ever once truly testing that belief against any real evidence, the way Barnaby finally tested his. Practice. Tonight, name this inherited belief aloud, plainly and without flinching, and consciously declare it no longer true for you, offering yourself, in its place, the freedom to believe otherwise. Chapter 7. Your Inner Frequency and What It Draws. Cornelius Hartley, a radio repairman of considerable skill, understood something in his daily work that most who merely listened to their radios never thought to consider, that a receiver tuned to the wrong frequency will never catch the signal intended for it, no matter how powerful that signal may genuinely be, no matter how clearly it is being broadcast from its source. The mind, too, holds a certain frequency of thought and feeling at any given moment, and money and opportunity respond only to the frequency actually being held in that moment, not to the frequency merely wished for or hoped after in some distant and disconnected corner of the mind. Adelaide Farrow wished fervently, night after night, for abundance to find her, speaking hopeful words and picturing pleasant outcomes, while remaining tuned, beneath those hopeful words, to a steady and unexamined frequency of worry and lack that colored everything she truly felt about her circumstances. She wondered, with growing frustration, why her sincere wishes seemed to go so consistently unanswered, never once realizing that her wishing and her true inner frequency were, in fact, two entirely different signals being broadcast at once. Consider, honestly and without flinching, what frequency you have actually been holding beneath your hopeful thoughts, apart from whatever you have merely wished were true about your own circumstances. Practice. Tonight, shift your inner frequency deliberately toward calm expectancy for a few quiet minutes, setting aside both worry and desperate wishing alike, and simply resting in a settled and unhurried confidence. Chapter 8. The Forbidden Truth About Deserving. Percival Lindquist had been taught, since the earliest days of his childhood, that only relentless suffering could ever earn a person the right to reward, that ease unearned through hardship was somehow suspect, even shameful. He found himself flinching inwardly, almost involuntarily, whenever ease came to him without the struggle he had been taught to consider its necessary price, as though he had somehow cheated some unspoken and sacred ledger by receiving without first suffering enough to deserve it. The forbidden truth, kept quietly from so many for so long, is that one is never required to earn the right to receive abundance, for such abundance was always a birthright rather than a prize that must be painfully and exhaustingly won through suffering alone. Genevieve Ashcombe allowed herself, rather guiltily at first, to simply receive an unexpected kindness from a neighbor without insisting, as she once might have, that she first prove herself worthy of it through some corresponding sacrifice or hardship. She found, to her genuine surprise, that this small ease repeated itself again and again in the weeks that followed, as though her willingness to receive without struggle had opened some quiet channel that her earlier insistence on suffering had kept firmly closed. Consider whether you, too, have been secretly insisting, perhaps without ever consciously realizing it, that you must suffer in some proportional way before you are truly allowed to receive. Practice. Today, consciously allow yourself to receive one small ease without requiring struggle to justify it, noticing whatever discomfort arises in you as you do, and gently allowing that discomfort to pass without heeding it. Chapter 9. Releasing the Guilt of Wanting More. Eugenia Marsh felt a quiet and persistent shame each time she allowed herself to genuinely want more than she currently possessed, having been taught, in countless small and unspoken ways throughout her upbringing, that such wanting was itself a kind of moral failing, a sign of ingratitude for what she already had, rather than a natural and healthy reaching toward what might yet be hers. This quiet guilt around desiring wealth is itself an obstacle placed by inherited belief, rather than any genuine and lasting truth, and releasing it opens the way for one's natural magnetism to work freely and without the constant friction of self-reproach standing quietly in its path. Roland Pemberton finally allowed himself, one otherwise unremarkable evening, to openly and honestly want more than he currently had, without apologizing for the wanting or immediately qualifying it with reminders of his own gratitude for what he already possessed, and noticed, almost immediately, a curious and unexpected lightness accompanying the release of guilt he had carried, quite unnecessarily, for so many years. Examine your own guilt around wanting more, honestly and without harshness toward yourself, and consider whether it was ever truly yours to carry in the first place, or whether it too was simply inherited. unquestioned. From voices that benefited from your carrying it. Practice. Tonight, name one desire for more, plainly and without apology, and consciously let go of any guilt attached to it, offering yourself, in its place, simple and unashamed permission to want what you want. Chapter 10. Opening the Gate. Your first act of magnetism. Edwin Thorne, a young apprentice locksmith learning his trade under a patient and exacting master, realized one afternoon, while struggling unsuccessfully against a particularly stubborn and ancient gate, that a single correctly turned key could open in an instant what years of forceful pushing and shoving had never managed to accomplish, however much strength and determination he had brought to the task. Becoming a money magnet begins with a single, deliberate inner shift, not with any outward change of circumstance attempted first. And this first shift is precisely the key that opens the gate to everything genuine that follows from it, however small and unremarkable that first shift may seem in the moment of its making. Silas Cobbett, a doubting neighbor of Edwin's family, waited patiently for outward proof before attempting any inner shift of his own at all, insisting he would believe once he saw results, and so remained standing, year after unchanging year, outside a gate he had never once genuinely tried to open, waiting for a proof that could only ever have followed the very shift he refused to make. Recognize that you now stand before this very same gate that Edwin once stood before, and that only a single deliberate inner shift, however modest, is truly required to begin. Practice. To close this first part of your journey, make one clear and deliberate inner shift tonight toward becoming a money magnet. A single sentence, a single feeling, held sincerely as your true beginning. Act 2. The Sacred Practices of the Money Magnet. Chapter 11. The Magnetic State. Frederick Ainsworth noticed, over many months of careful self-observation, that on the days he felt calm and quietly certain of himself, opportunities seemed to find him with an ease that almost embarrassed him, arriving as though summoned, while his more anxious days brought nothing in return but closed doors and disappointing silence, however hard he tried to force a different outcome. There exists a specific inner state, calm, certain, and unhurried, in which one draws money and opportunity most powerfully of all, and this state, far from being left to the whim of chance or circumstance, can be deliberately and reliably cultivated through sincere and consistent practice. Loretta Winthrop chased opportunity anxiously from morning until night, pursuing every lead with visible desperation, and found, to her growing frustration, that her very anxious pursuit seemed to repel the exact things she chased most fervently, as though her urgency itself were pushing away what her deeper wish most wanted to draw near. Consider the inner state you have most often carried throughout your days, and how it may have quietly shaped what has come, or failed to come, toward you as a result. Practice. Cultivate the calm magnetic state for a few minutes today, settling your breath, softening your shoulders, releasing urgency, and simply rest in quiet and unhurried certainty. Chapter 12. Becoming magnetic before sleep. Augustus Pennington began each night quietly feeling the ease and confidence of a man already prosperous, holding that feeling gently as he drifted towards sleep, and woke each following morning with a curious new steadiness in his outlook that gradually, over the weeks that followed, began to color his entire waking day. The hours before sleep offer the deepest opportunity to align oneself as a magnet for wealth, for the mind in this particular state accepts impressions with unusual depth and unusual permanence, far beyond what the same impressions could achieve during the busier and more resistant hours of full waking. Henrietta Blackwood spent her own nights instead, rehearsing worry and lack, turning over her unpaid bills and her disappointments as she drifted toward sleep each evening, unknowingly strengthening the very repulsion she so sincerely hoped in her waking hours to overcome. Consider how your own nights have been spent until now, and what magnetism, or what quiet repulsion you may have been unknowingly cultivating within them. Practice. Tonight, spend a few moments before sleep feeling wealthy and at ease, holding that feeling gently as your final and lasting impression of the day. Chapter 13. The Forbidden Words That Repel Money. Cornelius Whitmore repeated the phrase, "I can't afford that," so habitually, in response to nearly every purchase or opportunity that crossed his path, that he began to notice, with growing unease, how faithfully his circumstances continued to prove him right, again and again, as though his own words were quietly instructing his life to remain exactly as it was. Certain habitual phrases act as quiet instructions of lack, repelling the very abundance one claims, in other moments, to sincerely want. And these forbidden phrases must be identified honestly and replaced deliberately if true magnetism is ever to take hold. Marguerite Ashdown caught herself mid-sentence one afternoon, on the verge of repeating her own familiar, "I can't afford that," and replaced it instead with, "I am choosing not to spend on that, right now," a small shift in wording that nonetheless carried, she noticed, a subtle but genuinely real shift in her own sense of possibility and control. Consider the habitual phrases you use most often about money, and what those phrases, however casually spoken, may be quietly repelling from your life without your ever having noticed. Practice. Tonight, identify one repelling phrase you use often and replace it with a new, magnetic alternative, speaking it deliberately until it begins to feel natural. Chapter 14. Feeling Wealthy Before You Are. Bartholomew Gray, a modest tailor of unremarkable means, began carrying himself with the quiet ease and unhurried confidence of a wealthy man long before his ledger reflected any such fortune, and noticed, gradually and without any dramatic turn of events, others beginning to treat him accordingly, as though his own inner feeling had somehow rearranged the way the world responded to him. Genuinely feeling wealthy in advance, rather than merely thinking about wealth in the abstract, is what truly activates one's magnetic pull, for feeling carries a force and a weight that thought alone, however frequently repeated, simply does not carry. Ophelia Rutherford thought constantly of wealth, turning it over in her mind throughout her busy days, yet felt only anxious lack beneath those very thoughts, a persistent undercurrent of worry that her thinking never managed to dispel, and she wondered why her circumstances remained so stubbornly unchanged despite her considerable mental focus on the subject. Examine whether your own thoughts of wealth have been accompanied by any true and genuine feeling of it, or only by anxious thinking offered without any real warmth or ease beneath it. Practice. Right now, generate a genuine feeling of wealth and ease, however briefly, allowing it to settle through your body rather than remaining only a passing thought in your mind. Chapter 15. The Practice of Silent Assumption. Josephine Aldridge quietly assumed, without ever once announcing it to anyone around her, that a certain financial ease was already hers. Holding this assumption privately and without seeking any outward confirmation, and found this silent assumption steadily and quietly proving itself true over the months that followed. Quietly assuming one's desired financial reality, without seeking outward confirmation or approval from others, strengthens its magnetic hold far more powerfully than any public declaration ever could, for public declaration often seeks validation, while silent assumption simply rests in its own quiet certainty. Reginald Thistleton announced his ambitions loudly to all who would listen, seeking their validation and their encouragement at every turn, rather than truly assuming the reality within himself first, and found his loud announcements met with disappointingly little real change in his actual circumstances. Consider the real difference between quietly assuming a truth within yourself and merely announcing a wish to others in hopes of their approval. Practice. Tonight, Silently assume one specific financial truth without speaking it aloud to anyone, holding it privately and completely as your own quiet certainty. Chapter 16. Clearing the Static of Doubt. Nathaniel Cross, a radio operator by trade, understood well that even the strongest and clearest signal cannot be received properly through heavy static interference, however powerful the original broadcast may have been at its true source. Doubt acts, in much the same way, as a kind of static within the mind, weakening the magnetic signal one attempts to send outward into the world, and this static must be gently cleared before true magnetism can work unobstructed by its constant interference. Beatrice Hollingsworth practiced her magnetic assumptions faithfully each day, offering sincere effort to her nightly and morning rituals, but allowed constant and unexamined doubt to interfere throughout, and wondered, with growing frustration, why her results remained so faint and so inconsistent despite her genuine effort. Consider what doubts may currently be creating static around your own magnetic practice, quietly weakening a signal that would otherwise be clear and strong. Practice. Notice a doubtful thought as it arises, and gently clear it before continuing your practice, returning calmly to your chosen assumption without struggle. Chapter 17. The Daily Ritual of the Money Magnet. Ezekiel Barlow assembled a brief and consistent daily ritual from the many practices he had gradually learned, and found that the very consistency of the ritual itself became every bit as powerful as any single practice contained within it. It is not any single dramatic effort, but the devoted repetition of a simple, daily ritual that ultimately transforms magnetism from a mere idea into a lived and genuinely lasting reality, taking root slowly but surely through faithful repetition. Prudence Ainsley tried each practice only once or twice, with real enthusiasm at first, before abandoning it in favor of something new, never allowing any single ritual the proper time it needed to take root and prove its worth. Consider your own consistency in this practice, and recognize that a single day's effort is only the beginning of a much longer and more patient unfolding. Practice. Assemble your own brief daily ritual tonight from the practices already learned, and resolve to repeat it faithfully going forward. Chapter 18. Visualizing your magnetic field. Clarissa Fenwick pictured each day, in vivid and specific detail, money and opportunity flowing steadily toward her from every direction, as though drawn by some invisible and continuous current she could almost feel moving through the air around her. Vividly visualizing this magnetic field in action, held with genuine feeling rather than mere passing thought, strengthens the actual pull one exerts upon money and opportunity in the visible and tangible world. Wendell Ashby's own visualizations remained vague and rather half-hearted, picturing wealth only in general and indistinct terms, and he found his results just as faint and uncertain as the images he had offered his own mind. Consider whether your own visualizations of attraction are vivid and specific, or faint and uncertain, as Wendell so often were. Practice. Visualize money and opportunity flowing toward you from multiple directions tonight, filling the image with as much specific detail as you can summon. Chapter 19. Gratitude as the strongest pull. Winifred Ashgrove began each day quietly giving thanks for abundance not yet visible in her life, speaking of it softly to herself as though it were already fully present and fully hers, rather than something still hoped for from a distance. Genuine gratitude for what is not yet seen is the single strongest force behind magnetic attraction of all the practices offered in this teaching, for it convinces the mind, more completely than any other practice, that the desired abundance is already possessed and drawing steadily near. Leonard Ashcroft withheld his own gratitude until his circumstances visibly improved first, unknowingly weakening, through this very withholding, the exact pull that would have hastened the improvement he so patiently awaited. Consider whether you have been waiting for reasons to feel grateful, rather than allowing gratitude itself to lead the way toward what you desire. Practice. Give thanks tonight for one piece of abundance not yet received, as though it were already, simply, yours. Chapter 20. Waking as a magnet each morning. Beatrice Langley discovered that the manner in which she greeted each morning, calm and expectant, or hurried and anxious, seemed to set the entire magnetic tone for her whole day that followed, coloring even unrelated matters with whatever tone she had begun with. How one begins the day determines whether magnetic pull continues steadily throughout it or quietly fades before it has any real chance to work its influence upon one's circumstances. Roscoe Bellwether woke each morning already rehearsing his own lack before his feet had even touched the floor, undoing in mere moments the careful magnetic alignment his nightly practice had labored to build the evening before. Consider how you typically greet your own mornings, and what magnetic tone this habitual greeting sets for the hours that follow it. Practice. To close this second part of your journey, begin tomorrow with one calm, magnetic thought before rising from your bed. Act 3. Living as a money magnet. Chapter 21. Reading the first signs of attraction. Silas Merriweather began noticing small and unexpected pieces of good fortune appearing in his days shortly after taking up his practice, though he very nearly dismissed each one as ordinary coincidence, unworthy of any real notice or significance. Small, easily missed occurrences are often the earliest genuine proof that one's magnetism has begun to work, and learning to notice them strengthens the very faith that draws forth still more of the same in the days that follow. Ophelia Rundgren waved away similar small signs in her own life as unimportant, and so failed to nourish the very confidence that would have carried her further along her own promising path. Consider the small signs that may already be appearing in your own life since beginning this practice, signs you may have been too quick to dismiss. Practice. Note one small sign of attraction you have noticed since beginning your practice, however minor it may seem. Chapter 22. Becoming the person wealth is drawn to. Horace Pemberley stopped asking how to get more money and began instead asking what kind of person wealth would naturally be drawn to, slowly shaping his own bearing and manner to match the answer that question revealed to him. Lasting magnetism comes not from what one does to chase wealth, but from who one is quietly becoming while that wealth is drawn steadily near. Prudence Alderman chased opportunity after opportunity, without ever changing who she believed herself to be beneath all her chasing, and found each new venture ending in the same familiar lack that had followed her all along. Consider not what you are doing to attract wealth, but who you are being while you do it. Practice. Name one quality of the wealthy self you are becoming, and quietly assume it tonight. Chapter 23. When the old repulsion returns. Eugene Halloway, well along in his practice and genuinely encouraged by real progress, it was startled one difficult week to find his old habits of scarcity and worry rising up again as strongly as they had ever been before his practice began. Old patterns of repelling money may briefly resurface even after real and genuine progress has begun, and this is not failure but a natural passing stage to be met calmly rather than with alarm. Henrietta Coswell mistook this same return as proof that all her efforts had failed entirely and abandoned her practice in genuine discouragement, precisely when persistence would have carried her through. Recognize the return of old repulsion, should it arise, as ordinary and expected, not as defeat. Practice. When old patterns of lack briefly resurface, return calmly to your chosen assumption without alarm. Chapter 24. The patience required of a magnet. An old blacksmith named Gideon Thackeray understood that a lodestone does not rush what it draws, but simply holds its field steady until the iron filings find their own way to it in their own natural time. True magnetism unfolds in its own natural and unhurried time. and mastery requires genuine patience with this timing rather than demanding instant results from a process that was never designed to be rushed. Marjorie Applewhite abandoned her own practice after only a few days, expecting instant wealth to arrive, and so interrupted a process that had only just begun its quiet and patient work within her. Consider your own patience, and whether you have expected results before their proper season has arrived. Practice. Offer yourself tonight a quiet reminder, affirming patience with the unseen timing of your own magnetism. Chapter 25. Guarding your field from negative company. Josephine Kavanagh noticed that after spending time with a particular complaining friend, her own sense of possibility felt strangely diminished for days afterward, as though something had been quietly drained from her. The people and conversations allowed close to oneself can quietly strengthen or weaken one's magnetic field, and this field must be guarded with the same care given to any other part of this practice. Bartholomew Rees surrounded himself with those who constantly spoke of lack and misfortune, and found his own magnetism weakening the longer he remained in their company, as though their words were quietly draining his own. Consider whose company may be quietly strengthening or weakening your own field. Practice. Identify one relationship that may be weakening your field and consider a small boundary that could protect it. Chapter 26. Magnetism in Opportunity and Relationships. Frederick Lansing noticed that as his own magnetism for money grew stronger, favorable people and unexpected opportunities began to find him just as readily, as though the same current were carrying more than money alone toward him. The same magnetic law drawing money also draws favorable people and opportunities into one's path, for the underlying frequency being held affects far more than finances alone. Agatha Winslow focused solely on money while neglecting her inner state elsewhere, and found her opportunities and relationships remaining strangely limited despite her financial progress. Consider how your own magnetism might already be shaping more than your finances alone. Practice. Extend today's magnetic practice to include one relationship or opportunity beyond money. Chapter 27. Setbacks as realignment, not failure. Aloysius Grant was deeply discouraged when a promising venture collapsed entirely, only to find, months later, that its collapse had quietly redirected him toward a far better opportunity than the one he had lost. An apparent setback is often the magnetic field correcting itself rather than a sign that one's efforts have failed, guiding the reader toward truer alignment rather than away from it. Beatrice Nolloth resented an early setback so completely that she failed to notice the realignment it was quietly offering her all along. Consider a past setback of your own, and what realignment it may have quietly been offering. Practice. Reflect gently on one recent setback, and search for the realignment within it. Chapter 28. Those who practiced this forbidden path before you. An old harbour merchant named Ezra Thornbury built a quiet and steady fortune that others attributed simply to good luck, though he privately practiced a discipline he never fully explained to anyone. Quiet fortunes throughout history trace back to those who privately understood and used this same forbidden law, leaving faint traces in old letters and family memory for those who look closely. A young descendant, Charlotte Thornbury, discovered her ancestors' private journal and recognized with quiet astonishment the very practices she had just learned herself. Consider what quiet fortunes or habits may exist, unrecognized, in your own family history. Practice. Reflect briefly on one such quiet fortune from your own life or lineage. Chapter 29. Sharing the forbidden path without losing it. Clementine Marsh gently shared this forbidden path with a struggling friend, and found her own conviction and magnetism deepening as she did so. Teaching this path to others, freely and without insistence, only strengthens the teacher's own magnetism further, rather than diminishing it as one might fear. Ambrose Fenwick hoarded his newfound knowledge jealously, refusing to share it even with those he loved, and found his own progress growing strangely stagnant as a result. Consider whether there is someone in your life you might quietly share this path with. Practice. Identify one person with whom you might gently share a single teaching from this book. Chapter 30. The Magnet That No Longer Tries. An aged Rutherford Blake found that this practice had become so natural to him that wealth now seemed simply to arrange itself around him without any deliberate effort at all. Once this forbidden path is truly learned and lived, it ceases to be effortful practice and becomes the natural rhythm of an aligned mind, drawing wealth effortlessly without further striving. A young seeker, Wilhelmina Foss, visited old Rutherford and asked him the secret of his quiet fortune, only to be told simply that he no longer tries to attract wealth, for he and wealth are no longer separate. Imagine your own future self, for whom this magnetism requires no more effort than breathing, practice. Envision your own life, years from now, having lived this forbidden path so long that wealth simply meets you as you are. Epilogue. You now carry a forbidden inheritance, once kept quietly, from those who most needed it. The quiet, magnetic power to draw wealth toward yourself for the rest of your life, using nothing more than the steady alignment of your own inner state. What was once guarded so carefully by the few, hidden in misfiled manuscripts and unspoken family habits, now belongs openly to you. Consider the distance already traveled, from the first quiet uncovering of this hidden teaching to this final and settled understanding you now hold. Your own magnetism has already begun its quiet work, whether or not outward proof has yet fully appeared before your eyes. Wealth is no longer something to chase or beg for. It is a natural response to who you have now become, drawing steadily nearer with each day that follows, as faithfully and as inevitably as iron gathers toward the stone that asks nothing of it but to remain, quietly and steadily, itself